Have you ever held a secret so tightly it felt like it would crack your ribs? A truth you couldn't speak, a fear you couldn't show? For Alara, life was a collection of these silent burdens, lived within walls that were meant to be a home, but felt more like a cage. Her husband, Leo, and his father, Marcus, were the architects of this prison. They saw her not as a wife or a daughter-in-law, but as a fixture, a silent cog in the machinery of their lives, there to serve and be silent. Every morning was a ritual of invisibility. Alara would wake before the sun, her movements quiet as a mouse, preparing breakfast, laying out clothes, ensuring the day for the two men in her life would unfold with seamless comfort. She would fade into the background, her own needs and desires shrinking until they were almost gone. But on this day, something was different. The air was heavy, charged with a tension that was sharper than usual. Leo had been distant for weeks, his smiles thin and brittle, his touch fleeting and cold. He entered the kitchen not with his usual gruff indifference, but with a strange, forced pleasantry that set every nerve in Alara's body on edge. In his hand, he held a single steaming mug. "I made you coffee, Alara," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're always doing everything for us." "I thought you deserved a treat." He placed it on the small table where she usually ate alone, a place of brief solace. The gesture was so out of character it felt like a performance. Alara looked at the dark liquid, the steam curling upwards like a beckoning finger. It should have been a peace offering, a rare moment of kindness. But as the aroma reached her, a cold dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. It wasn't the rich, comforting smell of the coffee beans she ground herself every day. Beneath the familiar scent was a sharper, acrid note, something chemical and wrong. It smelled faintly, almost imperceptibly, of bitter almonds. Her heart began to pound a frantic, silent drum against her ribs. He had never made her coffee before. Not once in 5 years of marriage. And now he stood there, watching her, waiting for her to take the first sip. The smile on Leo's face was a mask, and behind it, Alara could feel the weight of his expectation. "Drink it," he urged, his voice softer now, almost a caress. "It'll get cold," every instinct, every nerve ending honed by years of navigating his moods and his father's cruelty, screamed at her. She thought back to the small things, the moments of subtle malice she had tried to ignore. The time her favorite sweater, a gift from her late mother, had accidentally been ruined in the wash with bleach. The way Leo would subtly undermine her in front of friends, making jokes about her being forgetful or clumsy, slowly eroding her confidence until she began to doubt her own mind. It was gaslighting by 1,000 tiny cuts, and she had bled invisibly for years. Now, this coffee felt like the final cut, the one that would sever everything. She looked from his insistent eyes to the dark surface of the liquid. The scent of almonds, a memory from a chemistry class long ago, echoed in her mind with a single, terrifying word: cyanide. Was it possible? Could the man she had once loved, the man she shared a bed with, truly wish her harm? The thought was monstrous, but the evidence was there, in the bitter aroma, in the unnerving break from routine, in the predatory stillness of his gaze. "What's wrong?" he asked, the mask of concern slipping to reveal a flicker of impatience. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" He was testing her, waiting to see if she would question him, waiting to call her paranoid, to twist her fear into another one of her supposed failings. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of terror and desperate calculation. She couldn't accuse him. He would deny it, turn it against her, and find another way, a more certain way. She had no proof, only a smell, and a gut feeling that was as powerful and undeniable as the ground beneath her feet. She had to drink it or refuse. Both options felt like a death sentence. One for her body, the other for whatever fragile piece she had left. She needed a third way. She needed a miracle. Just as the silence in the kitchen stretched to a breaking point, a loud, grating voice boomed from the hallway. "Leo. Alara. Where's my damn coffee? Am I expected to serve myself in this house?" Marcus, Leo's father, stormed into the room. He was a man carved from anger and resentment, his face a permanent sneer. He had lived with them for the past 2 years, and his presence had smothered the last embers of warmth in the home, leaving only ash and bitterness. He treated Alara like a servant and his own son like a perpetual disappointment. Marcus stopped and glared at the scene, his eyes narrowing on the single mug on the table in front of Alara. "What is this? Are you just going to sit there sipping your coffee while I wait?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. He looked at Leo. "Did you make this for her?" "Her? She's the one who should be serving us, not the other way around." "You're getting soft, boy." Leo flinched at his father's words, a flicker of his own resentment showing before he smoothed it over. "Dad, I was just—" "It's nothing, it's not nothing," Marcus barked, slamming his hand down on the counter. "It's about respect. It's about order. She needs to know her place." He turned his venomous gaze back to Alara. "Get me my coffee." Now, the command was a whip crack in the tense air. And in that moment, in that brutal, ugly demand, Alara saw her miracle. An idea, terrible and brilliant, sparked in the darkness of her fear. It was a desperate gamble, a terrifying leap of faith in her own intuition. The two men were momentarily locked in their own toxic orbit of dominance and submission, their attention focused on each other. It was a tiny window of opportunity, a crack in the prison walls just wide enough for her to slip through. Her heart hammered against her chest, but her hands, to her own surprise, were steady. She just needed a moment. A single, unobserved moment. With her back partially turned to the two men who were now arguing about Leo's perceived weakness, Alara's movements became a blur of pure survival instinct. On the counter behind her sat Marcus's favorite mug, the large, ugly one with a faded logo from a company he used to bully. Next to it was the coffee pot she had brewed earlier, its contents safe, normal, and untouched. Her mind was a flurry of calculations. Leo was watching her, but his attention was divided by his father's tirade. Marcus was focused entirely on belittling his son. The risk was immense, but the alternative was unthinkable. With a trembling breath that she held deep in her lungs, she acted. Her hands, so accustomed to silent, efficient work, moved with a speed and precision she didn't know she possessed. In one fluid motion, she picked up the poison mug from her small table. In the next, she swiveled, her body shielding the action from both men. She poured the dark, almond-scented liquid from her mug into Marcus's large, waiting cup. Then, just as quickly, she poured the safe, normal coffee from the pot into her own now empty mug. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. It was a sleight of hand born from pure desperation. She turned back around, her face a carefully constructed mask of timid obedience. She held out the large, ugly mug, now filled with the coffee Leo had prepared for her, to her father-in-law. "Here is your coffee, Marcus," she said, her voice miraculously steady, though her heart felt like it would explode. Marcus snatched the mug from her hand without a word of thanks, his eyes still locked on his son. "See? That's how it's done." "A little discipline," he grumbled, taking a large, noisy gulp of the hot liquid. Leo watched his father drink, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. Then his eyes flicked back to Alara, to the identical-looking mug she now raised to her own lips. He was waiting. She had to sell the performance. She took a small, delicate sip of the safe coffee, letting the familiar warmth flood her mouth. She met his gaze over the rim of the cup, her expression deliberately neutral. The trap had been set, but she had just switched the bait. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Alara's life. She sat at her small table, forcing herself to take slow, measured sips from her mug, the safe, warm coffee a stark contrast to the ice-cold terror gripping her insides. The kitchen was thick with a silence that felt louder than any argument. Marcus had taken his coffee and the newspaper to the living room, his usual grunts of disapproval providing a grotesque soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Leo remained in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, watching her. He wasn't looking at her with love or even concern. He was observing her like a scientist watching a specimen in a petri dish, waiting for a reaction. The intensity of his stare was suffocating. He expected her to falter, to show a sign of distress, to clutch her stomach or gasp for air. Every normal breath she took, every calm sip she swallowed, seemed to confuse and frustrate him. He was the snake, coiled and waiting for his venom to work, but the mongoose had not sprung. Alara focused on the simple act of drinking. She focused on the cracks in the ceramic of her mug, the way the light from the window hit the tiled floor. She had to be a statue. She had to be a ghost. She had to be the invisible woman they had always treated her as, because any sign of fear, any hint of the truth, would give her away. She could feel his suspicion growing with every passing moment. A small furrow appeared between his eyebrows. He had been so certain. The dose, the delivery, it had all been planned. Why wasn't it working? He took a step closer. "Are you sure you're feeling okay, Alara?" he asked, his voice laced with a false sweetness that was more terrifying than any shout. "You're very quiet." She looked up at him, her heart a trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She offered a small, weak smile. "I'm just tired, Leo." It's been a long week. It was the perfect, plausible lie, the kind of thing she said all the time. It was the excuse of the weary, overlooked wife he had cultivated. He couldn't argue with it. He just stood there, his trap failing before his very eyes, his mind reeling with a confusion that was slowly curdling into dread. Suddenly, a strange sound came from the living room. It wasn't one of Marcus's usual grunts. It was a wet, guttural noise, a choking gasp that cut through the silence like a blade. It was followed by the sharp scrape of a chair being pushed back violently, and then a heavy, sickening thud that shook the floor. Leo's head snapped towards the sound, his eyes wide. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, gray pallor. For a moment, he was frozen, his mind unable to process the impossible. The sound he had been waiting to hear from his wife had just come from his father. Alara stood up, her own performance kicking into high gear. She let her mug clatter onto the table, her eyes wide with feigned alarm. "What was that?" she cried, her voice trembling. Leo stumbled out of the kitchen and into the living room. Alara was right behind him. The scene was one of pure chaos. Marcus was on the floor, convulsing, his body rigid. His face was a terrifying shade of bluish-purple, his eyes wide and unseeing. His hand was clutching his chest, and next to him, shattered on the hardwood floor, was his large, ugly mug. A dark puddle of the poisoned coffee was spreading across the wood, the sharp, bitter almond scent now thick and undeniable in the air. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to this one horrific tableau, the fallen tyrant, the shattered cup, and the son whose perfect crime had just imploded in the most unimaginable way. Leo stared down at his father, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. This wasn't supposed to happen. His plan was meticulous. It was clean. It was meant to free him, not to create this nightmare. He looked from his father's contorted face to the spreading puddle of coffee, and then his eyes, wild with a dawning, unspeakable horror, shot to Alara. In that single, frantic glance, she saw everything. She saw his guilt, his confusion, his terror. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew that the contents of that shattered mug were what he had intended for her. Leo's mind was a maelstrom of panic. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He couldn't scream, she was supposed to drink it. He couldn't explain the poison without confessing to premeditated murder. All he could do was stand there, paralyzed by a guilt so profound it stole the air from his lungs. The architect of his cruelty, the man whose approval he had craved and feared his entire life, was dying at his feet because of his own murderous hands. Alara, meanwhile, moved with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The terror that had frozen her was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She rushed past Leo, grabbing her phone. "I'm calling 911, she shouted, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a panicked wife. As she frantically dialed, she watched Leo. He was crumbling, his composure shattering like the fallen mug. He fell to his knees beside his father, but it wasn't an act of grief. It was the collapse of a man whose world had just been irrevocably destroyed by his own hubris. "Dad? Dad," he choked out, the words hollow and meaningless. He looked at Alara, his eyes begging for an answer he could never ask for. His silent scream was deafening. How did this happen? Alara met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a carefully crafted mixture of fear and confusion. She was the innocent victim of a sudden tragedy, and he was the grieving son. It was the perfect story, and he was now a prisoner within it. He had to play his part. He had to pretend he didn't know why his father was dying. He had to mourn the man he had just accidentally killed. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost poetic. The very scheme he had designed to silence his wife had instead silenced his father and trapped him in a cage of his own unspoken guilt. The poison he had so carefully measured was now seeping into the foundations of his entire life, and he was utterly, completely alone with the horrifying truth. The wail of sirens grew closer, a sound that for years had signified trouble and fear for Alara, but now sounded like a promise of liberation. Paramedics and police officers flooded the house, their presence a stark, official intrusion into the domestic horror scene. They worked quickly, their movements efficient and professional, a whirlwind of activity around Marcus's still form. But it was too late. One of the paramedics straightened up, his face grim, and delivered the quiet, final verdict. Marcus was gone. Amidst the blur of questions and flashing lights, Alara found her anchor in a sharp-eyed, calm detective named Harding. While others saw a grieving family in shock, Detective Harding saw the details. She saw the shattered mug and the strange, chemical smell that still lingered in the air. She saw the wild, cornered animal look in Leo's eyes, an expression that looked far more like terror than sorrow. And she saw Alara, pale and trembling, but with an undercurrent of stillness, of quiet strength, that didn't quite fit the picture of a hysterical wife. Harding led Alara to the kitchen, away from the grim scene in the living room. "Can you tell me what happened from the beginning?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Alara took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath she had taken all morning. And she told the truth, or at least, a carefully curated version of it. "Leo, he made me coffee this morning," she began, her voice quivering just enough. "He never does that. And it smelled strange. Bitter. I was scared to drink it." She looked at the detective, her eyes wide and earnest. "My father-in-law, Marcus, he came in yelling. He demanded his coffee. So I just gave it to him. I didn't think. I could never have imagined." She let her voice trail off, letting the detective fill in the blanks. Harding listened intently, her gaze never leaving Alara's face. She glanced at the mug Alara had been drinking from, still sitting on the small table. Then she looked back at Leo, who was being questioned by another officer, his answers stumbling and incoherent. He couldn't provide a straight story. He couldn't explain the coffee. He was a man drowning in a lie he couldn't speak aloud. The perceptive authority figure, the catalyst for justice, saw the pieces clicking into place. She saw the abusive dynamic, the strange behavior, the conveniently swapped cups. She saw a victim, but it wasn't the man lying on the floor. It was the quiet, resilient woman standing right in front of her. The investigation was swift and decisive. The forensic team collected samples from the shattered mug on the living room floor. The preliminary tests confirmed Detective Harding's suspicions almost immediately. The coffee contained a lethal dose of a cyanide-based poison. The bitter almond smell was the classic tell. When confronted with this physical evidence, Leo's fragile composure completely disintegrated. He was in an interrogation room, the walls closing in, the weight of Detective Harding's steady gaze pressing down on him. She didn't need to yell or threaten. She simply laid out the facts. The poison was in his father's cup. The same cup that Alara, his wife, claimed he had originally prepared for her. The same wife who had a history of being marginalized and controlled within the household. "Your wife was afraid of the coffee you made her, Leo," Harding stated, her tone even. "Why would she be afraid? Why did it smell like poison?" Leo began to sweat, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that didn't exist. He stammered, denied, and tried to weave a web of confusion, but the threads were too weak. He tried to paint Alara as unstable, as confused, but the evidence of the swapped cups was a silent, damning testament to her clarity and her fear. "We know the coffee was meant for her, Leo," Harding said, her voice dropping, sealing his fate. "The only question is why." That was the final blow. Faced with the undeniable scientific proof and the utter implausibility of any other explanation, Leo broke. Sobs racked his body, not sobs of grief for his father, but sobs of self-pity, of a trapped coward whose malice had backfired spectacularly. He confessed everything. He admitted he wanted Alara gone, that he saw her as a burden, an obstacle to a life he felt he deserved. He had planned her death with cold, meticulous calculation, never once imagining his cruel, domineering father would become the victim of his own dark ambition. He had sought to destroy the gentle soul in his life, and in doing so, had been consumed by the very toxicity his father had instilled in him. The monster had inadvertently devoured its creator. The house, once a prison of suffocating silence and unspoken threats, was now just a building. Its power was broken. Alara walked out of the front door for the last time, not as a widow in mourning, but as a survivor stepping into the light. The air had never felt so clean, the sky never so vast. She carried nothing with her but the clothes on her back and a newfound, unshakable belief in her own strength. The quiet woman who had been trained to be invisible had finally been seen, not just by the law, but by herself. She had discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed, a will to live that was stronger than any poison. Her intuition, that quiet whisper she had been taught to ignore, had screamed at the crucial moment, and she had listened. She had not only saved her own life, she had exposed a darkness that thrived on silence, causing it to collapse in on itself. As she walked down the street, away from the wreckage of her past, she felt not bitterness, but a profound sense of peace. She was free. Free from fear, free from cruelty, and free to build a life on her own terms, a life where her voice would be heard, and her spirit would never again be caged. Alara's story is a stark and powerful reminder that our deepest instincts are there to protect us. It teaches us that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest, but about listening to the quietest voice within, the one that knows the truth even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. It shows us that, even in the darkest of circumstances, there is hope, and that the human spirit has an incredible capacity to endure, to fight back, and to find its way into the light. Never let anyone convince you that your feelings are invalid or that your fears are irrational. Your intuition is a gift. Trust it. Protect it. It might just save your life. Share this story with someone you love to remind them of the incredible power that lies in trusting their gut. What would you have done in Alara's place? Let us know in the comments below, and never, ever stop listening to that whisper.